So my name is Ted Henkin. I am, for another maybe 18 hours, I am the president of the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy, ASCE, and I will be handing over the reins of this organization to our newly elected president, Carlos Sagely. But they designed the conference and the organization very intelligently, and I'm staying on for the next 2 years as the president ex officio, the vice president, to continue to help organize these great events every year and the other things that we do over the year. What I wanted to do to start off with this morning is just give you an idea of who is sitting around the room next to you. You may know some people, but one of the things that we were aiming at is that you would meet new people this year and every year to expand the people here. So what I'd like to do to start off with is just welcome a number of our special guests who have come to Miami, to the United States, from abroad. I'm just going to name them. If you hear your name, please just wave your hand so people can look at you and say, oh, I didn't know you were here, or I've never seen you physically before, but I know your name. So first of all, Emily Morris from the University College of London. We have Arch Ritter from Carleton University in Canada. Arch. We also have Gregory Beniowski, who is Havana Consulting, Canada and Havana. We have Vegard Bai from Norway. We have Ambassador Martin Palaus, former Czech ambassador to the U.S. and now at Florida International University, who's on the panel here with me this morning. Michael Strauss from the Center for Diplomatic and Strategic Studies in Paris. Okay, back there, great. We also have Sarah Romano from the University of Turin. I think she's actually on a plane from Havana today, and she'll be arriving a little bit later today. But she comes to us from the University of Turin in Italy. We have at least 4 participants over this next 2.5 days from Spain. Anyone here now who is visiting us from Spain or at the conference from Spain? We also have 2 participants who come from Peru, Yesenia Alvarez, Yesenia, and your colleague, and they have come also sponsoring 3 Cubans who've come from Cuba. So we really welcome all of our participants from around the world. What's probably most notable, however, is that like last year and the year before I became president, we have continued the tradition of expanding the presence of people from Cuba. Cubans who come directly from Cuba. There are many, many people in the room from Cuba, but there are also many who are from Cuba in the last week who got on a plane and flew directly from Cuba. And so I'm not going to name all of them because thankfully there are more than I could name in the time allotted to me. We have more than 20 people who have come directly from Cuba for the conference, and that is a record, and it builds on last year's 12 or so that we had, and in the previous years 1, 2, or 3. So this is a tradition that we definitely plan to continue. Among the people, however, who I want to point out are visiting us from Havana is the keynote speaker for tomorrow's lunch, and this is Miriam Leiva. Miriam, if you could just raise your hand. And she will be speaking tomorrow, giving a keynote address called Cuba in Transition and its relationship between Cuba and the United States. Cuba en Transición y las relaciones Cuba-Estados Unidos. And that presentation will be given in Spanish, but Ramón Barquín, el tercero, did us the job of translating the presentation into English, and we will have copies of that to hand out tomorrow so that you can follow along in English, the presentation. You have a copy of it in English. Also, if you look at your programs, you'll see that today we have a special treat for lunch, besides the food, which will be provided. If you signed up, if you look at your the first page of the program, you'll see on Thursday at lunchtime at the bottom of the page, there is Diálogo con Emprendedores Cubanos, cupo limitado, reservation required. So if you want to go to that lunch and you haven't already registered, get on your cell phones now and send an email to Stephen Kemmerling. There's only about 5 or 10 more spots. Stephen Kemmerling is in the back. You can all tackle him if there's any more spots. or bribe him. He does take bribes, but always over $100. That lunch is special for two reasons. One is that we have partnered once again with the Cuba Study Group, who is sponsoring the lunch, and the Cuba Study Group has asked Phil Peters of the Cuban Research Center to moderate that lunch, and the discussion at the lunch will be with 5 women, all from Cuba. That's why it's called Emprendedoras. And actually, when I first wrote the program, it said cuentapropistas, and Tomas corrected me. He said, well, actually, they told me that they don't consider themselves cuentapropistas, even though that's what the government likes to call them. They consider themselves emprendedoras. And if you know Spanish, those two words might be translated as the same thing, but they mean very different things in terms of your perspective as you approach entrepreneurship and starting a business. And so there are 5 business women who will be speaking about their experience starting a micro enterprise, a small business in Cuba, and that will be today at lunch. Again, that's optional and was added to the program after we were approached by the Cuba Study Group. So we thank them for their collaboration. In the interest of transparency and to highlight our aim here at ASCE to always become more inclusive and pluralistic, I also must report that, unfortunately, a number of our invitees from Cuba could not be with us today. There are 2 Cubans who are on panel 18, the very last panel on Saturday, who will not be with us. That is Eduardo Lopez Bastida and Rosendo Romero Suarez. They were not issued their U.S. visas in time to make it here. They're actually still waiting for those visas in Havana, and it's very doubtful, unless it's a miracle, that they will get them to be able to participate even on Saturday. And so, even though this is a lamentable fact, I still must condemn the folks both at the U.S. interest section and at the Cuba desk in the State Department, because while they did not always have good news for me when I pestered them with calls and emails and tweets, and while they not very often told me what I wanted to hear, one of the things that they did do, which was very pleasant, which was they always responded to my messages and my emails, and we really worked together over the last 3 months to make sure that as many of the people that we invited in Cuba, regardless of their background or political persuasion, was able to get a visa. And so we're very proud of that. One change, if you look up here on the table, is that there are no women. And if you're looking at the program, you're saying, well, where is Miriam Zelaya? Miriam Zelaya, if all goes according to our plan B, is on a plane right now from the Cayman Islands. She flew to the Cayman Islands and then from there to Miami. And so she should arrive later today and will be replaced on this morning's panel by Rolando Castañeda, and hopefully she'll be here in time to replace him on the second panel. So that's a switcheroo we did, but Miriam Zelaya is still planning on being here, and we've really worked hard to make sure that she is here. So keep your fingers crossed, but that is in the works. There were also at least another 5 Cubans who aren't with us, who were invited and who did express to us their desire to be a part of this conference. These are 5 Cubans who work at the University of Havana, who are economists, and we extended invitations to them, but unfortunately they were not given permission to participate by the institutions of higher education where they work in Cuba. Despite this lamentable decision, we want to send them and all of you a clear and public message that our invitation stands, that this is their association too, and that we cannot arrive at a full understanding of what we call Cuba's perplexing changes without their help and critical analysis. So before I go ahead and introduce our speakers and shut up and let them talk, I wanted to refer you guys to 2 things that I read recently that I think would be enlightening, especially in terms of getting some of those people who aren't here, getting their take on what's happening in Cuba, Cuba's perplexing changes. Just recently, Jorge Sanguinetti, a former president of ASCE, sent a number of us an email, was forwarding us a link to a website called Cuba Profunda. And at that website, kind of a website blog, there is a series in the month of July of 4 very long kind of posts written by Ariel Terrero. And the title of that series is 12 Economistas en Pugna. And I want to just make sure I understood that word impugna, or those two words, so I actually looked it up to make sure I got it right. And I translated it as 12 economists in conflict, or 12 conflictual economists. I guess you could interpret it different ways, but I recommend that you go to that site and take a look at those 12 economists. Ariel Terrero is an economist in Cuba, and he interviews 12 other economists to really get their take on what he considers the big problems and the disappointments, especially at mid-year this year in the Cuban economy, especially the scaling back of the expected rate of growth and some of the lackluster performance in various areas of the economy. And speaking of lackluster performance, I want to refer you to the new edition of Cuba News. It's just out this month. On the cover page, there's a really good article by Domingo Amuchastegui, who's here. Domingo? Okay. And he actually gives a really good rundown of some of the discussion from the recent meetings in the Cuban Parliament that was really looking at this lackluster performance and kind of examining why that is there. So take a look at that article and that issue. It's a very enlightening one. All right, so what I'd like to do now is just mention some kind of rules of the game. We like to have a pluralistic, inclusive exchange of ideas, but we also all need to follow rules of time, starting on time, arriving early, and especially for our sessions, staying on track in terms of the time we're allotted, and following rules of decorum and civility. I know a lot of us feel very strongly about Cuba and the Cuban economy, but in order to have an open, pluralistic discussion, we have to follow rules of respect for other people's opinions, especially while they're talking. If you want to make a statement, you're welcome to make a statement, but make it brief, or ask a question, but make it brief. Try to stick to the point. And especially I want to emphasize that ASCE does not tolerate insults, personal attacks, innuendo. We're an academic organization, and our discussion should rise above those things and focus on analysis, on data, on argument, and on a civil, interactive discussion between people with different points of view. If we all agreed, it would be a very boring conference, and so hopefully it will be a very lively conference. One note about language, idioma. He estado hablando en inglés para comenzar el congreso, pero este debe ser un congreso bilingüe, y es de hecho un congreso bilingüe. We're going to have a bilingual conference, and if you see, we've made the innovation this year on the program. Whenever there are two panels happening at the same time, we've tried to group most of the Spanish presentations, Spanish language presentations, in one panel, and most of the English language presentations in another panel. This is just to benefit those who aren't bilingual so that they have an option in their language. Entonces durante cada panel hay dos opciones, una opción en inglés y otra opción en español, para dar opciones a los que no dominan los dos idiomas. Okay? So just note that. If the title of a presentation or a panel is in Spanish, you can bet that most or all of the presentations of that panel will be in Spanish. El título indica el idioma de cada panel o trabajo. Okay, great. So without further ado, let me present to you Joaquin Pujol, who will be speaking first. He's a retired from the IMF, and I like to call Joaquin Mr. ASCE. So Joaquin, please let me set up your presentation. He's the institutional memory of our organization. This one here? Okay.
I was asked by the organizers to try to start the presentations with a little bit of a going over some of the policies that have been adopted by the Raúl Castro administration over the last few years, and what kind of actions were taken, what kind of problems were encountered or being trying to address, and what kind of results have obtained. I'm going to try to summarize what I presented. I'm working on a longer paper on that, but to try to keep it to the limit of the conference. This is pretty much the agenda, the policies focused by the Raúl Castro administration, and the particularly liberalization of the agricultural activities, improving worker productivity, allowing limited private activities, removing excessive prohibition, revising tax policies, allowing private citizens access to credit, addressing the shortages in housing, transportation, and infrastructure, and resolving external payments arrears and strengthening the balance of payment. These were the ones I picked as the main, particularly that are reflected in what comes out in the press abroad, commenting on the policies of the. Now, some of these policies are in response to some of these problems. Cuba has to import about 80% of the food requirements right now. Cuba used to be an exporter of food before the revolution. It is heavily dependent on imported energy, as you all know, particularly from Venezuela, which now becomes a little bit of a doubtful source for the long term. Has an overblown and inefficient public sector that has been recognized certainly by Raúl Castro and the government, has low productivity and lack of appropriate incentives, does not have the necessary financial resources to meet the existing requirements for investment, and now there is a big campaign to try to get foreign investment into the economy, and has a poor track record of meeting foreign obligations and limited access to external credit. And again, the way they've tried to get around that is by approaching political friends in other governments to try to get them to provide some of the funding. And there is certainly need to implement substantial structural reforms to be able to improve the economic performance. As I indicated, there are, and this is a little bit of repetition of the previous one, so I'll go on. This is just a listing of the main policy areas focused. What were the main policy areas in the agricultural sector? Well, first, individual farmers were given the small plots of land in usufruct. Second, they allow the establishment of agricultural cooperative, and they allow the farmers some access to banking credit. What were some of the problems? Well, farmers still have to sell a good part of the crop to the state acopio at prices that may not reflect market conditions, and the payments many times are late. I understand that there are now rumors that the government is about to dismantle the acopio. I think that would be a welcome move, but something has to substitute it to be able to provide for the distribution of the goods. There is a scarcity of supply of fertilizer, pesticides, tools, fuel, and farming equipment, and they're all provided basically by the government monopoly. You are not allowed to import these things directly by the individuals or farmers, so you have to depend on the government to provide you with these things, and there is not a wholesale market really organized to be able to distribute these things. And what happens is that bureaucratic corruption creeps in the assignment of land, in the assignment of credit, in the availability of the agricultural inputs, and this is quite widespread, and that is a big source of problem. The land that was made available for the most part is covered with marabou. When Fidel Castro decided to eliminate the Cuban industry of sugar industry, when they failed to meet the 10 million crop, and he decided, well, if they can't meet the 10 million crop that I promised, they better finish. No more, we will not produce sugar anymore. And he dismantled the sugar industry, and the land was left fallow, and it became covered with marabou. Marabou is a plant that grows wild and has very little use for anything. In fact, about the only use that I know of marabou is that you can burn it and make charcoal with it. The marketing and distribution system is marred by arbitrary bureaucratic controls and mismanagement, and thefts are prevalent, both in terms of the people that control the distribution system as well as the people that are not even the producers of the goods. There is a lack of capacity for industrial processing of the agricultural products, and this is partly due to obsolete equipment that has to be replaced. Government material ministries are reluctant to let go of their businesses and allow the cooperatives to replace them, so there is a bureaucratic battle going on this account. And the amounts of banking financing that has been given so far has been minimal. As a consequence, the agricultural production remains relatively stagnant, despite already some period that some of these actions have been in place. And food imports are projected for 2014 at $2 billion. 1 million hectares of arable land remain uncultivated. This is about 16% of the total land that is available for cultivation. And a significant portion of the crops is lost to spoilage, theft, due largely to the poor marketing and cumbersome marketing organization, and the fact that when a product is put up for sale at the retail level, the prices are controlled, and therefore, if the produce begins to spoil, the person who's marketing that cannot lower the price, cannot determine that perhaps he could sell it at a discount because he has to respect the price controls that exist. The sugar production last year only reached 1.6 million tons, which is less than 1/4 of what the historic records that Cuba used to achieve before the revolution. Coffee production was only amounted to 6,105 tons, which is less than half of the need for consumption in Cuba. So Cuba will have to import coffee. Cuba, before the revolution, used to produce 10 times what it produced this last year. The herd of cattle is 1/2 what it was in 1958. And this year, there were quite a few cattle that died, quite a large number that died, and it died because of lack of food. They didn't have, when you eliminated the sugar industry, one of the byproducts of the sugar industry was the bagasse that used to be fed to the cattle. That disappeared too. So you have all kinds of problems with that. And the milk production, instead of increasing as had been promised by Raul Castro, has declined over the last year, and so did the production of meat, potatoes, citrus, and a number of fruits. Before coming to power of the revolutionary government, Cuba was an exporter of sugar, coffee, meat, vegetables, and fruits. But the persistent scarcity of these basic produce, such as milk, coffee, beans, beer, meat, potatoes, shows that the reforms that have been implemented have very significant limitations. With respect to workers' productivity, the first big measure that was announced was the reducing redundant labor in the public sector and trying to tie individual wages to individual productivity. The government announced a retrenchment of about 1 million people in 2011. It also announced that differential wage scales would be implemented, taking into consideration differences in productivities of the workers. Previously, practically all workers would receive the same pay irrespective of their productivity. And a large number of public enterprises and government agencies were to be closed, merged, and turned over into cooperatives. The steps were taken to improve the accounting practices and management control of the public enterprises and to subject some of them to the payment of taxes, which they never did before. So what are some of the problems? The implementation of the retrenchment of the public sector has proved to be very difficult to implement, partly because of resistance of the bureaucracy. And in fact, the original timetable of having 1 million people leaving the public sector has not been kept. Equally difficult has been the implementation of the different wage scales according to productivity. There has been great reluctance on the part of the bureaucracy to have some of these things implemented. And then there have been favoritism and both in the terms of who is left out and who gets the pay and so on. And the productivity gains, of course, are not easily achieved, particularly when you have over 3,000 companies, government companies, public sector companies that have difficulties. The true productivity and profitability of the enterprises is difficult to monitor because costs and prices are distorted by the existence of a multiple currency practice, exchange system, and a dual domestic currency, which makes it almost impossible to find out whether a company is really profitable or not. The public sector service industries are, for the most part, operating with machinery, tools, and other supplies that dating back to the Soviet era or even pre-1959 and are obsolete and incapable of marketing, production, and financial obligations. And the state companies are the #1 source of losses and defaults, causing deficits and disruption in the relation with other state companies and with the national banking system. And some 941 of these companies have been identified as being highly vulnerable due to corruption. So the productivity, again, the original timetable, as I said, was passed on. Turning to the private activities that were allowed, a specific list of 187 activities have been identified as eligible for self-employment, which involve mostly service and menial activities. The measure allows individuals to legalize activities that may have been conducted previously in the black market, but to do so, they must register with the government, pay a license, and become subject to taxation. Some types of privately organized cooperatives have been authorized. However, what are some of the problems? Well, first of all, no professional or technical activities have been authorized. The number of activities, in fact, is small, as I mentioned, and any activity that is not specifically listed is still prohibited, and means that if you engage in them, you can be subject to jail or fines or whatever. While the number of registered self-employed rose from about 100,000 to about 467,000 at the beginning when this was allowed, in the last year there have been very few additional companies that have, additional self-employed that have been added to the list, and the majority, they have been also, the majority of the people that did this were either people that were not officially government employees, they were retirees, or people that were not working at all for the government. The very heavy taxation and regulation that have been imposed on these activities, many times established in an arbitrary and bureaucratic manner, tends to affect the activities. And we will hear some of the contrapropistas and people that are here that can talk about this during the conference. So the government has in fact even revoked the licenses of certain activities because they were competing too much with the public sector enterprises. Well, I'm going to try to cut it short because I'm being told that my time is running. So you will have a chance to get a copy of my paper down the road. I also mentioned removing the excessive prohibitions, authorizing the sale of computers, printers, cellular telephones, and other hardware. Some of these things have been done, but then they are still limited. I mean, you still cannot really have free access to the internet. You still, so some of these activities you allow a little bit of a leeway, but then you take it away with the other hand. And this is part of the perplexity of what is it that they're trying to achieve. The subject of migration policy is a very important one, but there was a paper that was presented last year by Larissa Divergen at ASCE, so I'm not going to talk about that because I would take another conference. Talking about the problems with excessive prohibition, there are still very significant limitations on some of these activities, which I had listed in the paper. For example, of the some of the things that were done, like allowing people to buy automobiles. Well, 6 months have happened since the bill was passed by the legislature, and only 50 automobiles have been sold by the state. And other limitations and prohibition continue to limit the activity. So while the number of limitations have been lifted, in general, the system is still very restrictive, and anything that is not specifically authorized is prohibited or illegal. Tax policies, again, this will be a subject that will be discussed in the conference, so I'm not going to go into details of that. Private access to credit, this is quite limited so far. There is a need for financial mechanism to be established to finance mortgages, to do all kinds of things that do not exist. And of course, foreign banks are not allowed to operate there. So the results are limited in that area. I think I have to stop. So, well, let me just, so as you see, there's a lot more there. But the conclusion, basically, that I go through there is that while progress has been made in some policy initiative in coping with some of the problems faced by the Cuban economy, the overall results that are yielded so far are far from satisfactory for the problems encountered. And on the basis of the situation and how the depth of the problems face the economy, frankly, unless there are very substantial reforms, structural reforms adopted, I just don't see how the goal of being able to move Cuba into a stable rate of growth is going to be achieved. Thank you. Thank you.
Joaquin, thank you very much. I'd like to now present Gary Maberduke. Gary Maberduke is retired from the U.S. Department of State and spent a number of years as part of that job, career in Havana. He's also been a member of ASCE probably as long as he was in the State Department, maybe longer, and he was just elected to the new 2014-2016 board of ASCE, so he'll be around. He was on the board before, so I give you Gary Maberduke, and let me set this up.
Okay, so last March, I returned to Cuba after a 14-year absence. I had served there from 97 to 99 in the U.S. interest section. Now, with much of my intellectual capital depleted or outdated, I felt I needed to return to refresh that capital, to see how things had changed, and to see places and talk to people that had been forbidden to me as an American diplomat. My first impression was that there had been considerable change. The city, Havana, seems to have been spruced up. Many buildings have new paint. Many have undergone renovations, and there are new apartment buildings, especially in Miramar, and there are lots of new restaurants. Today, there are numerous excellent restaurants, both private and public. The populace look better dressed, the spandex is gone, and it appears that everyone now has new tennis shoes. All right. So, everybody has new-looking tennis shoes, and that really surprised me. I mean, people are much better shod. There are far more retail shops for food and clothing. I found a hardware store, which was non-existent in Havana 14 years ago, a private bakery, even a tropical fish store. Small fresh food stands are also scattered through the city, in addition to the farmers' markets. It appears the entire country now has relatively new refrigerators. Everywhere I went, including in the countryside, they're there, and compact fluorescent lights. This is one campaign that the Cuban government seems to have succeeded at. There was also electrical power. 14 years ago, prolonged blackouts were the norm. My own home was powered by perhaps 20 hours a day by our own generator. During my 18 days in the country this time, I experienced just 2 blackouts of less than 15 minutes each. Public transport is also much better. With new Chinese buses on the streets in Havana, and old American cars serve as collective taxis. With new engines, they traverse standard routes at reasonable prices. Regular taxis are also plentiful, and they now come from China, new Chinese cherry sedans, which I understand the Chinese won't eventually export to us. I traveled from city to city on new, comfortable Chinese buses. On Cuban salaries, they were not cheap, but they were nevertheless full of Cubans. The hundreds of people waiting along the central highway, hoping to hitch a ride in a truck or some other vehicle that was so present 14 years ago, and as often you can see in old Cuban movies, has now not disappeared, but seems to be limited to much smaller groups. Once I got past the initial impressions, however, I discovered that for many Cubans, there was little change. A tour through the section of town called 10 de Octubre, near the port, reviewed a landscape of ruins and severely dilapidated buildings. This was the Havana I left 14 years ago, and I could see no change at all, if only things were worse. It is still home to tens of thousands of Cubans. There were no restaurants, few shops, and no street-side fresh food markets. Even walking through my old neighborhood of Miramar, which is the diplomatic, wealthier section of town, I found many homes that had continued to decay. Several old neighbors saw little improvement since I had left, even when I pointed out there was now power and public transportation. Their biggest complaint was high food prices and salaries that had not kept up. Almost everyone, even those who had clearly benefited, were anxious to point out that many of their compatriots were being left behind, and the growing inequality was likely to get worse. Virtually anyone with whom I discussed the economy would eventually utter the comment, "Aquí no se hace nada." Here, nothing is made. That was true 14 years ago, but is noticeably more apparent today. There were no Cuban products in the hardware store. Inexpensive plastic items have been replaced with Chinese ones. There is more clothing available in more clothing stores, but no clothing made in Cuba. I once bought a quite serviceable espresso coffee maker and a pressure cooker made in Cuba. No longer. Even in the supermarkets, processed foods seem to have disappeared, replaced with products from Spain, Argentina, and Ecuador, but interestingly not Venezuela. Cuban rum, some coffee, beer, soft drinks, fruit juice, and tomato paste are the only processed food I could find from Cuba. In 10 de Octubre, I passed the detergent factory which was operating, and an automobile parts assembly plant that wasn't. A World War II meatpacking plant is still open. A pre-World War II meatpacking is still open, but a metalworking complex seemed at a standstill. In Placentas and Santa Clara, 2 aluminum plants are still operating. I believe one of them is simply recycling cans. But the plastic plant is closed, and a very large electrical appliance plant that once made fans and other electrical appliances for the entire country now only does repairs. A factory that makes agricultural implements had a lone tractor-pulled cultivator in an otherwise empty parking lot. In Guaní, on the eastern tip of Cuba, they bottle soft drinks and have several fish processing plants. So where is Cuba's future? And that's far too soon to say. But in the medium term, it is clearly the export of medical services. During my visit, it was announced that Brazil would import several thousand more medical workers. Reckoning their contribution to the Cuban economy, the government has doubled or tripled the salaries for nurses while I was there, even for those working at home. I believe that Cuba's current system of government-to-government agreements to export health workers, which essentially taxes the bulk of their pay, will eventually break down, although it will take some time. However, now that Cubans can freely leave the country and then return, there appears nothing to stop the doctors from finding their own positions overseas. Presumably, many will send home remittances, and Cuba may become like many other developing countries who depend on such remittances. However, If Cuba's continue to grow, it will need more foreign investment. There seems almost unanimous opinion in the country on that point, and is reflected in the new foreign investment law announced just after I left, which in principle opens up most of the entire country to foreign investment under very favorable conditions. We will see how it works in practice, but some criticisms of the law seem to miss the point. The first criticism is that it discriminates against Cuban citizens. It does, but only insofar as they are not part of a joint venture. Yet most Cubans need foreign capital to build their business and look for it from family or foreign businessmen. The owner of one bed and breakfast place told me he had borrowed $10,000 from his family and now paid it back. He had no problem in sending the money out of Cuba. Another B&B owner also had some family help, but also benefits from customers who help finance improvements in exchange for free room and board. Restaurants are often joint ventures. The other criticism is the continuation of the policy requiring firms to hire through labor exchanges, where traditionally the government takes 90% of the wages. That policy and an inappropriate exchange rate caused the failure of the free trade zones in the 1990s. However, in the new special economic zone in the new port of Mariel, the wage policy has been changed, and the labor exchanges can now take no more than their actual transaction cost at a maximum of 20%. If that policy is applied to all other foreign investment, and if the exchange rates are unified, that problem may largely disappear. That, of course, are two large ifs. Monetary unification. Most economists and journalists with whom I spoke seem quite confident that monetary unification will take place by the end of 2015, as proposed in the lineamientos. Exchange rate unification is supposed to take place at the same time. But one prominent, well-connected economist told me that exchange rate unification would cause a decapitalization of some state firms, and some accommodations would have to be made. I had the impression this was causing a lot of headaches for the Cuban economic team. Agriculture. Exploring recent developments in Cuban agriculture was one of my principal goals of my trip. I obtained far better access to Cuban farms and farmers than I expected, but in many ways I still left with many unanswered questions. Agriculture is clearly in a state of flux. In Vinales, I stayed with a third-generation tobacco farmer. He has 166 acres, and for the last 2 years, a third-generation tobacco farmer. He has 166 acres, and for the last 2 years has produced about 6 tons of dried tobacco annually. In 2013, he received about, I think I'll make it. In 2013, he received about 7,000 coops, old Cuban pesos, for his crop. This year, he received 55,000. He has one full-time employee who originally worked for his grandfather and several part-time workers. He also grows corn, coffee, beans, and has 12 milk cows. He and his family are doctors. They have a newish car he brought back from his work from Ecuador. He gets credit from the bank. His inputs from his Cooperativa de Crédito y Servicio, and seemed quite satisfied, although he has no intention of expanding at this point. I heard a similar story from a tobacco farmer in Pinar del Rio. I think he dedicates more of his time to his farm, and I think he is planning to expand. A pig farmer in Placetas was also quite content with his current situation. He is a new usufructario. He had a small farm before, but he traded for a much bigger parcel. He has 166 acres and is hoping to obtain more from the government, which he thinks he's going to get. He has 300 pigs and delivers thousands of pounds of pork to the government every few months. He reported credit has not been a problem, and he gets his feed from his Cooperativa de Crédito y Servicio. He is now also starting to breed purebred quarter horses, but it was not clear to me where his market was for the latter. He spent $14,000 to buy those 2 horses. A pineapple grower in Matanzas was also pleased with his situation and sends thousands of the pineapple to the market each year. I think he said 60,000, but I may have been wrong. Again, no problem with credit or inputs, but he complained about the high cost of transport to the market. I haven't mentioned the Acopios, and that's because hardly anybody mentioned the Acopios to me, except when I ask. And they seem to be being phased out. They, to a large extent, collect enough produce from the farmers to supply the hospitals and schools and other basic government needs. But there seems to be a considerable diminution in their thing. I also, in visits to 2 closed sugar mills, I believe I find the answer to one question that's bothered me for several years. What happened to the workers? What happened to the workers that have been in those mills? The answer seems to be that many have retired. There were a few young employees when the mills were closed, and so they decided to retire. A few have gone to work at other mills. Some work in the ubi peces as they engage in other farming, mostly cattle ranching. Got it. And some are working as usufrutarios on land granted by the UBPC, an arrangement not allowed entry at the Quinta de Septiembre sugar mill in Cienfuegos, but it was producing and seemed in good working order. The mill is a joint venture with Brazil. The government has 7 other mills they would like to find partners for as well, but so far no takers. All these mills were built after 1980 and apparently would not be affected by Helms-Burton. New legislation on agriculture is very important. I will not go into it in any detail. It's in the paper, but it has substantially increased the terms which you can get property. It's now 25 years instead of 10 and renewable. It allows for inheritance, allows for reimbursement for residents built on the property, and allows the purchase of farm inputs from cooperatives rather than Acopios. Major incentives to increase production. This didn't pass until 2013, so, okay. My sense, perhaps just a hope, is we're likely to see these changes so extended to the entire country. I got 2 quick graphs on agricultural production. Come on. There we go. And what you see is, if you look at aggregate totals, you don't really see much of a trend. It doesn't really show you that there have been any improvements. However, if you get a little different and you look at the agricultural production growth in the private sector, mostly the credit consumer, there is a definite an improvement in many areas. And while I would not call this a trend that I would want to say is likely to continue, I think it's at least the beginnings of sign that maybe we're going to see eventually see these policies begin to take effect. Finally, as I said, I'm hopeful. Finally, my favorite quote of the whole trip. Tengo afecto a Fidel. Cerebro. Nos engañó al pueblo cubano por 50 años. Es muy cerebro. Yo tengo afecto a Fidel. And that was told to me by a young woman on the road between Santa Clara and Havana. I am fond of Fidel, intelligent. Yes, get this last paragraph. He deceived the Cuban people for 50 years. He is very intelligent. I am fond of Fidel. Absolutely the best quote. The overwhelming sense of my contracts on a trip, Quintal Pieces, economists, ordinary Cubans, anytime even Raul, was that Cuba's old economic was a failure. Yet there were no expressions of anger I encountered in 97-99. Fidel seems to be a comfortable but eccentric and largely irrelevant grandfather figure. Surprisingly, Raul seems to get little credit for the economic reforms. He compares unfavorably to Fidel, who most people believe was an excellent teacher, even if what he taught was wrong. Everybody wants the government out of the economy except for health care and free education. They are bored or apathetic to politics. Their attitude is reflected in the state of the committees for the defense and revolution, which was so long the mainstay of political control. In Havana, at least, they have been marginalized. Some people told me their only function was to hold occasional parties, and even then, few people attend. One respondent was not even sure if the CDA even existed. Okay. Basically, Cubans want economic freedom, they want capital, they want nothing to do with politics. A new Milton Friedman visiting Cuba would be very comfortable discussing economics with Cubans today. That is probably one of the best omens for the future. Sorry if I ran over. Yeah. Copies of my paper in front. There's plenty for everybody, so we'll wait till the end of the session.
Look at your program again. We've had Rolando Castañeda, who is in the second panel, going to be replacing Miriam Zelaya, whose plane should have landed, cross your fingers, in Miami Airport about 5 minutes ago. So hopefully she'll be able to replace him on the second panel. Rolando Castañeda is retired from the Inter-American Development Bank, and you can see that his paper is entitled Cuba. Why have Raul's policy updates not been successful?
Of what is happening in Cuba, because I don't think that the authorities want to change the system. And unless you change a failed system, you won't have results. That is basically my position. The economic situation in Cuba right now is quite difficult. I don't want to enter in all the details mentioned by Joaquin, but it's very important to have those in mind. And also, if you have some doubt, read the new, the Nuevo Herald with the statement by the Cuban authority of what is happening in Cuba. In my opinion, these poor results that I will touch on them later on are due to the Soviet socialist system that it is in Cuba. A famous professor from Harvard, Janos Cornell, wrote an article several years ago in which he described why he considered that this system was supposed to fail. And that is why the Soviet Union, distant European countries, China and Vietnam decided to change the system as it was. It is very important to have in mind that Cuba has made 3 rounds of economic reforms since the early 1980s. In my opinion, one of the mistakes that people made when they analyze Cuba is, well, Raúl started making reforms in 2007, and you have to give him time. These reforms are difficult, etc. But if you look at what has happened in Cuba in the last 34 years, Cuba has been doing more or less the same type of reform for those years. So, in my opinion, the main feature of the Cuban socialism are in place and have not changed much. That is more or less an overall view of what I plan to cover. If you look at the economic situation in Cuba right now, there is a stagnant economy, low and declining rate of GDP growth. There is a high dependency on Venezuelan aid. There is a low investment rate, so low that is the lowest in the region, and it has been less than 10% for most of the last 5 years. The salaries, according to the studies made by Pavel Vidal, are 20% of the level that they have in 1989 in real terms. So that means that it's quite difficult for most of the Cubans who depend on those salaries to have a decent standard of living. Cuba has also a high unemployment rate, disguised unemployment rate due to the plantillas infladas, and this is a problem that is not easy to get rid of it, and it will last for some years, even if the government take the right measures. There is a deterioration of education and health services. You can look at the dengue and cholera epidemics almost every month in Cuba due to the poor sanitary conditions. There is an expansion of the housing shortage. Most of these problems were typical of the socialist Soviet economies in the late 1980s, and that is why they decided to change the system. Also, we have to keep in mind that the socialist Soviet system has lasted in Cuba 55 years, 10 more years than in Eastern Europe. What are the characteristics of this system that Cornell considered that determine the behavior of the economic agents and political of public officials, and that make the economy to be in this condition? According to Cornell, there are 3 characteristics. There is a full and inflexible and exclusive political power and control by the Communist parties. There is a collectivization of property rights, and usually you have a state or quasi-state enterprises running most of the activities. Most of the decisions taken in the economy are done by the central authorities through administrative control and regulation. So after studying these features and try to make changes in Hungary for many years, Cornell arrived to the conclusion that you cannot reform the system. You cannot make marginal changes and try to improve the result of the system. And that is why all these countries, Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, Vietnam, China, decide to make some changes. It is important to have in mind that Cuba has 3 rounds of reforms, one from 1980 to 1985, that was stopped by the proceso de rectificación de errores y tendencias negativas. What Fidel Castro stopped in 1986? Free agricultural markets, self-employment workers. There was a foreign investment law in 1982 that was stopped before it started to bring any results. In 1993 to 1996, Fidel Castro started to make changes again. In what areas? The same areas. free agricultural market. He transformed the small and medium state farms into agricultural cooperative. He encouraged, again, self-employment workers. Maybe the most important decision that he made to encourage the economy and to increase growth was the promotion of tourism, the new law on foreign investment, and the legalization of foreign exchange holdings that allow people to receive remittances from the outside. Unfortunately, and again, he slowed down or reversed some of these reforms, justifying it by increasing corruption and greed in the society. I won't enter in the details of the reforms from 2007 to today because already Joaquin mentioned them, but I think that some of the new areas of reform have been a flexibilization on the agricultural cooperative that did very bad from 1993 to 2014, and this failed prototype of cooperative now is copied in the service and production areas. I know that Professor Ritter considered that maybe this is a superior form of organization for the economy. But I have the opportunity to visit recently Yugoslavia, or the former countries of the Yugoslavian country, and I tried to talk to several people. What was different with your cooperative that made the economy grow faster than in other Soviet socialist economies? And the explanation that I got is, no, we receive a lot of foreign aid from different countries because of our independent political position, and also we have more political freedom. As a matter of fact, some people from Romania and Bulgaria left those countries and entered Yugoslavia without any problem, and they were able to emigrate to other countries. So basically, this cooperative and the Mariel Free Trade Zone are right now the two more promising areas of the reform made by Raúl Castro, in the sense of promoting the private sector. But I think that they are quite limited, and in my opinion, they won't get any results. So, in conclusion, after 34 years of reforms in Cuba, the political institutions remain more or less the same. There is not tolerance for dissent, or loyal opposition, or benevolent criticism. There is a new aberrant labor law. There has been no ratification of the Human Rights Convention signed by Cuba in 2008, because some people in Cuba consider that they are binding. Regarding ownership, several people have studied what percentage of the GDP is generated by the private sector today in Cuba? And more or less the estimates are that they are around 20%. Why? Because Cuba doesn't allow private small and medium enterprises that were confiscated in 1968, so 46 years without small and medium-sized enterprises. Independent workers are limited to few service activities. I already talked to the cooperative. Unfortunately, Professor Ritter was not here. And the foreign direct investment right now is limited to mining, oil, and tourism. Regarding economic coordination, centralized command decision prevail in the economy. There is very important distortion in the exchange rate, in prices, in salaries. The role of the market forces is very limited, particularly in the labor market in a labor surplus economy. It is unbelievable, in my opinion, to charge to the foreign enterprises for people hired in Cuba $200 when the usual salary in Cuba is at most $20, $25. This is a distortion. You don't have to be an economist to understand that if you charge $200 for something that's supposed to cost $25, you have a major distortion. So, in conclusion, I think that Cuba faces two major problems with all this reform. One is backwardness. Cuba is in deep economic problems, and also it has a dysfunctional and hopeless Soviet socialist system. Unless you make changes in these two areas, I am not very optimistic about Cuba. Sooner or later, there are going to be changes, but what is needed is not an upgrade of the system. What is needed is to make systemic changes, especially in the three areas mentioned: political institutions, property rights, and coordination by the market. Cuba has been looking for many years to the Chinese and Vietnamese experiences that have been quite successful to generate high rate of growth. But I think that Cuba should also look at some successful Eastern European countries that, besides improving their standard of living with the similar changes made by the Chinese and the Vietnamese, they also made changes in the political area and gave rights to their population. Thank you much.
Rolando is doubly intelligent. His presentation was excellent, but he also, every time I gave him this thing that told him his time, he would take it from me so that I couldn't remind him the next time. Our last speaker for the opening plenary is Ambassador Martin Palaus. He is currently serving at Florida International University. He heads up the new Václav Havel Center for Human Rights and Diplomacy there. Formerly, he was the Czech ambassador to the United States. He spent 4 years from 2001 to 2005 in Washington, D.C., and he joined me in New York City from 2006 to 2011. And now he is joining us in Miami. So please give a warm welcome to Ambassador Martin Palaus.
Thank you for this nice introduction, and thank you for having me under this special occasion. I would like to first congratulate the organizers for picking up a really inspirational title for the event, the Cuba's Perplexing Changes. When I read that, I immediately was reminded of a very old piece, classical piece from political philosophy of Europe in the Middle Ages. Rabbi Moshe ben Maimonides wrote a book called The Guide for the Perplexed, and with the intention to promote the true understanding of the real spirit of the laws. And even more inspirational is Maimonides was born in Cordoba, which is Spain today. Then he was rabbi in Morocco and died most likely around Cairo in Egypt. And he wrote his book in Arabic himself, so that it was translated into Hebrew only by one of his disciples. Why I'm saying that right now is that really we need to start thinking about why we are perplexed and what is the reason of that strange situation. And I think that we may be able to find some similarities between the situation when Maimonides had to say what he had to say, to be able to make a distinction between what is good and what is right. Very simple question. I hope that I will not sound a little bit narcissistic when I will now start a little bit from my own experience with the Cuban question. 3 points I would like to make here because I think that they are relevant for the discussion. In 1998, 2001, I was a deputy for a minister in Prague. It was the year when the United States presented unsuccessfully the resolution in Geneva and Commission for Human Rights, and we were asked to step in as representatives of Central and East Central European tradition connected with the fall of communism in our part of the world. Interesting story here is that it was for me the first exposure to the subtleties and difficulties of bringing together economics and human rights of Cuba. As you well know, for United States, any connection here was no go, no forbidden, no economic language in the resolution. For Europeans, obviously, it was almost must, and the third part of what I later called the Bermuda Triangle, Latin American countries, they had their own vision. And here, the only problem was we did need to win, we did need to have votes, so that we had to find some sort of communication between these three elements. So this is my first argument to think about, whatever I'm going to say here about the European position. It needs to be perceived within the Bermuda Triangle. Number two, when I started to be ambassador here in the United States, but already in the connection with these activities in Geneva, I established intensive communication with the Cuban American or with Cuban community here. And I realized that this communication that obviously was heavily and still is influenced by all sorts of tricks of Raul Castro's government and difficulties of understanding or perplexities, if you want to say, in this situation. But I realized that this internal Cuban dialogue is key for the success. So obviously our question is, what can we Europeans from our part of the world do to help you with your own dialogue? We are not partners, we are maybe sometimes outside observers, but we, I think, can do something. And then it brings me to my third stage. I'm not only directing a new established center at FIU, but I'm also president of International Platform for Human Rights in Cuba, which is an entity supported by National Endowment for Democracy. Representatives of this institution, organization are here today also, but it has a very specific role, because I think that we have two basic, I would say, principles in our philosophy. First is to enable, to become an enabling partner for these inter-Cuban communications, but more importantly, to come up with some sort of efficient international strategy, to make Cuban voice more efficient when it is being translated into the context of multilateral, bilateral, interstate relationships. Because here there is a problem to address the issue of Bermuda Triangle in its complexity. And maybe also it gives Cubans, to all of you, an opportunity to see your case from a broader perspective. From a perspective which obviously today can raise a lot of unpleasant questions. What Vladimir Putin was doing in Havana recently, and what kind of arrangements he has been suggesting to their Cuban counterparts. What is, and I'm speaking for me, for European perspective, what does European Union has demonstrated itself in the recent situation connecting with the Ukrainian crisis and so on and so on. And here in the United States, I followed the turmoil after the publication of FIU poll that really stirred up a big controversy here, or the letter of this group of entrepreneurs suggesting to President of the United States to make certain steps, and again, controversies, controversies, controversies. In this situation, still, I believe that our role is significant, and here, what I would like to do is to inform you about what's happening between Cuba and the European Union in context of this new bilateral treaty that is to be negotiated. And again, reading Diario de Cuba and other materials and talking to the people here, I know that the whole thing raised a lot of questions, even emotions. Just yesterday, very respected and brave Cuban dissident Iris Perez Aguilera, she, when she was in Washington, she said something about that she doesn't have any expectations from the feckless European Union. I understand the point, but I would dare honestly to disagree with this position, and I will try to explain you why. I'm going now to give you some information from internal European Union processes, but there are some basic fundamental questions here. And one is very general: how to cope with totalitarianism? How to cope with the situation that totalitarianism has a tendency to do certain metamorphosis, as it was described here, and call it transition to something, but we are not sure where we are. And then to one question which comes from my Czechoslovak experience: normalization or normalization? Because the basic intention you can read in the explanatory memorandum when the European process was starting, first internal European process to bring together so-called negotiation instructions for the external European service, and I will come to this point shortly, was to have finally with Cuba normal instrument similar to the instruments used in the relationship of European Union with tens of countries around the world, and not to be led by, I would say, the exceptionality of this relationship because of totalitarian nature of the Castro's regime. So can this relationship be normalized so that Cuba is finally turned into a normal country? One alternative. The other alternative, can the normalization of Czechoslovak style in the 70s be a future of the Cuban totalitarian government now? Can they keep themselves in power and become recognized players internationally? Is it betrayal or an opportunity? I mean, the negotiations that are to start between EU and Cuba. I think that set of all, opportunity. First of all, it's not wise to convince the world that it is betrayal if the negotiation is about to start. It's rather opportunity for us, and let's see where the opportunity is. I will come later to a certain comparison I would like to make you to think about. The comparison would be with Helsinki process that took place in Europe in 1975. And my argument is that if there is something we can share with you as inspirational experience from our part of the world, experience of transitions, I think that for good reasons we need to start right here. And I will tell you why. Because this experience was connection between three baskets of the final act of Helsinki Conference: peace and security, economic cooperation, and human rights. And I remember in '75 many people were saying the final victory of Leonid Brezhnev because status quo was recognized by other negotiating partners, including the United States. But it turned out that the question of human rights, the third seemingly least relevant basket, human rights and humanitarian affairs, turned out to be key and maybe one of the significant elements in the fall of the Soviet Empire in general. So what's going on in the current negotiations? The question asked by many is whether so-called common position that was adopted in 1996 by the European Council is now being betrayed when this process of negotiation started. First of all, it's very interesting to follow the internal discussion leading to these negotiation instructions. There were at least some European countries very adamantly going to the formula that common position stays in power, is valid, until it is replaced by a new bilateral treaty. And this bilateral treaty is supposed to adopt or absorb all the principles contained in the common position, which means human rights remain in the center of the relationship between the European Union. And the fact that now we are going to look at the possibility of having bilateral, which means legally binding, treaty between the European Union and Cuba, it is much stronger instrument, speaking, for the human rights, because common position is just unilateral declaration. And if you see the realities of today, at least 12 European countries have at this moment bilateral agreement on cooperation with Cuba. There was a big debate here concerning so-called suspension clause, whether the negotiation should have this conditionality to be suspended in the case of, I would say, totally unacceptable behavior on the side of the Cuban government. It's interesting to see which states of the European Union were supporting suspension clause. Germany was the first, by the way. And what's going to happen here? So we have a centrality of the human rights. We have suspension clause. And we have also a question, and I know that it is maybe for technical debates among lawyers, what kind of treaty is it going to be? Treaties are seen as a secondary source of law right after the foundational treaties of the European Union. So they had to be connected directly with, I would say, basic legitimacy of the whole operation. And this mixed, these treaties have very often give rights and obligations not only to the organs of the European Union, but also to the member states. And member states would like then to argue that these mixed treaties need to go through the process of ratification in the capitals. So if we have maybe a tendency of certain bureaucrats of the European Union to do things quickly and to have rather friendly relationships with their partners, whoever these partners are, member states have here a very important role to play exactly in this particular context. So what I'm saying is that this gives a chance, let's say to us, to design a strategy, to send the message out. And I think the centerpiece is, again, what I said in the context of the Helsinki process, the role of civil society. It's interesting that in this draft of negotiation agreements, there was a fight around, in the context of participation of civil society, of the adjective organized or not. because obviously the Cuban government has certain concept of civil society to be under 100% control of them, and not allow and blaming or labeling independents as enemies of state, and you know all these adjectives given to them. So I think that here is the diplomatic battle for the Europeans. If they want to normalize relationships with Cuba, they should be able to apply all general principles they have for the human rights defenders, for right to participation in political life, and so on and so on. So I think that there was just first round of negotiation so far between EU and Cuba, and the second, already substantive part should start, I think, in the end of the next month in Brussels. Here, I think that the moment of truth is coming. Moment of truth for both parties, whether they are willing and ready to comply with the rules, which would be following the experience of the Helsinki process and giving a chance to civil society, but real civil society, to feed the process with certain information and feedbacks. There was a meeting of leading Cuban dissidents, let's put it that way, in Warsaw. And interestingly enough, Warsaw Polish government sent a courier to Brussels asking, first of all, informing the other member states, and also asking that some sort of body should be created to help these independent communications, and not to be cheated by the still ongoing propaganda of the Castro's regime. So, last sentence to conclude, I really believe that here is rather an opportunity than betrayal, and that there is also a lot to think about our general concept and use human case as a not only self-contained perpetuating story, but as an enlightening example for the others. Believe me or not, seeing the situation in Middle East, I'm strongly convinced that Cuba can be turned into most successful case of process of democratization. It's much easier than what you have in all these countries in the Middle East, for sure, where Maimonides was coming from. Thank you.